Welcome to the XT Podcast, your ultimate destination for valuable insights, practical advice, and inspiring stories that will transform the way you experience business, governance, and life. Join your host, Ashutosh, as he dives deep into three distinct editions: Customer Experience Edition, where industry leaders discuss CX strategies, product brand, employee experience, digital innovations, and best practices for improving customer engagement, retention, and loyalty.
Have you ever wondered how the language we use in the workplace can dehumanize or empower employees? How can leaders shift from simply engaging employees to truly making work more human? And what does it mean to empathize, encourage, and empower employees in a way that fosters genuine connection and commitment? In this episode of the XT podcast, we dive deep into these questions with Eryc Eyl, a seasoned speaker, coach, and consultant with over 3 decades of experience in transforming work into a path of greater satisfaction and fulfillment. Eryc is also a storyteller, a playwright, and a DJ. Eric's insights are not just theoretical, they are grounded in his extensive cross functional experience across various industries. Eric's book, Stop Engaging Employees, Start Making Work More Human, introduces us to the concept of the 6 E's of employee engagement, a framework that emphasizes empathy, encouragement, education, enablement, empowerment, and embrace. Throughout our conversation, Eryc shares profound insights and thoughts on why employee engagement must evolve beyond traditional metrics and how leaders can cultivate a more human-centric workplace. Join us as we explore how listening more and talking less can transform leadership, why recognizing and celebrating the right things can drive real engagement, and how the simple act of asking the right questions can lead to thriving organizational culture. Let's welcome Eryc Eyl to the XT podcast. This conversation is bound to challenge your perspectives and inspire you to rethink how we approach employee engagement in today's fast-paced world. Let's dive in. Thank you, Eryc, for joining us at the XT podcast. It's an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
The pleasure is mine, Ashutosh. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. At the very outset, Eryc, especially because you have had such an interesting career trajectory, from having a bachelor's degree in English literature and film to then having a master's degree in education, followed by decades of deeply cross-functional and cross-industry exposure and experience, which is very rare. And then now being a speaker, author, coach, consultant, and educator, you wear several hats at once. You clearly walk the talk when you say that work doesn't have to be a 4-letter word, but just a path to greater satisfaction, fulfillment, self-actualization, and so on. So what led you to this insight? It's a very unique perspective towards work. When we first talked, I felt this is something very unique, and I would love to ask you what led you to this. And also, when you look back at your life, professional life especially, what have been the biggest learnings and insights that have led you to this insight?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ash. I haven't actually thought about it that much, so I will be formulating this on the fly. But I love the question because I do think it's a big part of who I am, and I think it begins with my very first corporate job. I've mostly spent my career up until the past 10 years or so working in big corporations, and my first job was working in General Electric company, one of the biggest companies in the world, and this was in the 90s, so it was actually big and successful at the time. And I remember being, I never pictured myself being in a corporate job. As you said, I had an English literature and film background. I didn't picture myself in this context, but here I was, making a paycheck. And early on, they required me to go to a time management class. I was required to go to a time management class. It's now become Franklin Covey, but it was Franklin Quest at the time. And I thought, I have to go to this training class. This is going to be awful. All they want to do is teach me how to manage my time so they can squeeze more out of me, and get more work. And I went to this class, and this gentleman named Bob Heavers, to whom I am forever grateful, Bob started this time management class, helping us clarify our values, our personal values.
Interesting.
And he really came from the heart. He said, none of this matters if you're not working toward what you truly matters to you. And so we spent this time, and of course I was a young person. I was in my 20s. I didn't really exactly know what I cared about, but going through that exercise and realizing that I can use this thing called work as a path toward becoming the best version of myself. And
Nice.
that aha moment was super powerful to me. I actually worked for that company for 10 years, and I had a boss in that same company where I had started with, what are your values? What do you care deeply about? I had a boss in that same company who, every time I went to him with a concern or a complaint, honestly, about how things weren't working, how the organization was not functioning correctly, he would say, well, that's why they call it work. As if work was somehow synonymous with discomfort and displeasure.
Gosh.
And this was his mantra, and made me very sad. It made me very sad.
Sure.
Because I thought, no, that's not what this is. What this is life.
Correct.
And what we're doing here should matter. And so I would say those two things are what first comes to mind when you ask me that question about starting to clarify how work can be about human flourishing, not just about making a living.
How amazing. And who would have thought, Eryc, that a time management session would end up being a self-discovery session of sorts, right? May
Yes.
I ask and probe a little bit on what was the connection between time management and values? How did it correlate? Where did that self-discovery get triggered?
Yeah, I mean, I think where the connection comes in is we understand that time is a limited resource. We know
Correct.
time that it is a non-renewable resource.
Right.
And so we must choose carefully how we choose to spend our time. And
Nice.
I think that's so powerful to think about, right? To say, like, so when we're managing our time and we're prioritizing our to-do list, what are we prioritizing against?
Correct.
So we can prioritize against getting stuff done, right? Accomplishing tasks. But if we're not prioritizing against some larger context, some goal. I was just in a session this last weekend. I was at a conference, and an incredible speaker named Rene Rodriguez said, wherever you use the word time in your sentences, substitute the word life and realize how powerful that is.
Profound. Wow.
It was really, it really moved me. This is just a couple of days ago. He said, people say, I really am wasting my time. But if you say I'm wasting my life.
Wow.
That's
how profound.
Or is that a good use of my time? I'm not sure if that's a good use of my time, because I'm not sure that's a good use of my life. It's really profound. Wow. So I think that was the connection that was made back in the 90s and restated by Rene Rodriguez in a really powerful way.
How amazing. The way you put it now, just this one word being replaced, it just profoundly changes your perspective towards time, towards work, towards life. And I remember the first time I reached out to you, we had a quick conversation, and I happened to mention I like to consider employees as assets. And I remember you mentioning that's not how you would want to think of them. Most organizations today, when they talk about employee engagement, they say employees have to be engaged too, whereas you bring in a nuance and you say employees have to be engaged with, and that grammar matters. And again, this is where you profoundly change the perspective with which we look at employees, that, they must be equal partners in the process of engagement, not merely the recipients of outreach efforts. Can you elaborate what you mean by this? And also, how did it all help you to come up with those 6 E's of employee engagement? Would love to hear from you on that.
Sure, Ashutosh, thank you. So I think what this all comes back to for me, to the promotion, protection, and preservation of human dignity. And human dignity is in danger, I think. And employment contexts, I think we are a little cavalier with how we treat human dignity. When we do treat people, when we say we're going to get these people engaged, we're going to engage employees, we're viewing them as objects. We're viewing our fellow humans as objects to be manipulated or moved. And that's not a place from which dignity comes. Dignity comes from a sense of agency in your own life, of self-efficacy. And we're all looking for that. All of us are looking for that. That doesn't mean that we don't want to serve. That's a different conversation. But we all are there as ourselves. And so this idea of preserving and protecting and promoting human dignity at work and elsewhere is really underlying everything that I'm doing and working on and talking about. And so that led me to this idea, myself, of having been in these corporate contexts where I felt personally the most dramatic word I can use for it is dehumanized. And I think it is what we do, right? We use these terms. We use the term employee. We use the term labor, workforce, human resources, human capital. All of these things are dehumanizing. And so when you and I talked about this idea of being assets, there's a couple of things there. First of all, that is an object. Second of all, in the English language, the word asset implies that there's ownership. And I don't think that feeling that owned by someone is a path toward a dignified life, toward a fulfilling life,
Not
toward
at all.
human flourishing in general. So not at all. So I appreciate the spirit behind people saying, employees are our greatest assets. I know what they're trying to
Sure.
say. And I believe, and I know that you believe, the words we choose really matter and can affect what's possible.
Of course. Cannot agree more. In fact, what I've often seen is in the spirit of productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, outcomes, and so on, you end up thinking of the entire employee journey as an operational workflow of sorts, and you want to efficiently move the
Yes.
the dots and pieces to kind of optimize it, and therefore then employee then becomes just a block to be moved around or
Yes.
transformed as and when needed. And I totally hear you. And what I've often missed out is the factor of empathy, because even dignity, for that matter, Eryc, should ideally come from empathy, isn't it? And I know when you mean that employees have to be engaged with, I know that in a way you're implying that engagement is an outcome, it's an emergent property. It will happen when you engage with the employees. The engagement will happen over time, so it's an emergent property. And in the same vein, then I think empathy is an intrinsic property, right? Like all of us being human should have empathy, naturally empathetic. But that is not how, when we work in a professional environment, we end up being. The professional leadership, stakeholders, all of us, somehow we dehumanize ourselves first, and then we end up dehumanizing others as an effect. I feel it's common sense, but somehow we all, and I have been on the wrong side of this equation as well, Eryc. I admit that, because the environment in a way forces you to think on these terms, and but what I miss out on is how is it that such a simple thing, a commonsensical aspect of empathy, which would lead to all these other things that you just rightly mentioned: dignity, respect, mutual respect, and other things, right communication, all of this we miss out on. So is there any way to build empathy, inculcate empathy, which should ideally be an inherent property, but which is not? So is there any way to build it? Any factors that you can share?
It's a really powerful topic that you've brought up, and I listened to you speak on it. What occurs to me is a couple of things. So first of all, I think the metaphors that we use, as much as our words, our metaphors really matter. And so when I think about the phenomenon of employee engagement, it's a condition we develop, and I liken it to the condition of love.
Nice.
Have you ever fallen in love, Ashutosh?
Of course.
Have you ever fallen in love?
Of course.
Yeah. Did that person make you fall in love? Did they create that love in you? No, the love came from within you for that person. And that's what this is like. And if you try to make someone fall in love with you, you end up doing horrible things. It's truly an unethical approach to life, right? So you can't make someone fall in love with you. You can't make someone become engaged either. So I think that matters too. But also, when you talk about empathy, I am stuck on this word love, because I do think at the heart of empathy is something like love. Now, we tend to think of love as being romantic love, right? But there are many different kinds of love. The Greek philosophers had 7 different kinds of love, right? There's an element of love for our fellow humans that comes through this. So can it be inculcated? I don't think so. However, I think it can be cultivated. I think we can, and it starts with, just like trust. I think empathy begins with showing empathy, and then you get to empathy. But you can't get to empathy without listening to people. Right. I think this is where we get back to the words we use. If we refer to our fellow humans as assets or as capital, that one actually makes me physically ill. You could tell. When we don't empathize with capital, we don't empathize with assets. That's not a thing we need to do. But the term that you'll hear me use over and over is our fellow humans, and our fellow humans are deserving of empathy. And we can't develop that empathy if we don't start by listening, and listening deeply. And I think as we do that, then we start to demonstrate empathy, and then we start to see it spread. I get this question from leaders. One of my favorite people that I talk to are people who run customer service centers, call centers, and they'll come to me and say, what's the best way to teach our agents to be empathetic? And they want their customer service representatives to be empathetic to customers, and that's absolutely important and good. And of course, I'm full of more questions than answers. And my question back to them is to say, how are you showing them empathy?
Nice.
How are you showing your call center representatives empathy? And so often I get a blank stare, because it's not something that's been expected. Right? It's not something that's even been thought about. It's not because these call center leaders are bad people. Of course they aren't.
Of course.
But they've gone through work with this mechanistic metaphor that you described, this
Right.
view of the workplace as a machine, right? It's one big machine, and we're all cogs in that machine. Right? So you don't show empathy to a cog either. They've just come from this metaphor. They've come from this place of these assumptions, and so their question is, how do we take these cogs and make them empathetic cogs? You don't make them. You start by showing them empathy. So, early on in the pandemic, I had people coming to me saying, now we've got employees working from home. How do we keep them motivated?
Right.
And, in March of 2020, I said, that's the wrong question. The question is, how do we take care of them?
Nice.
How do we keep them safe? How do we make sure they have what they need? Those are the right questions. And so that actually is and it's not the beginning of the 6 E's, but you find that in those 6 E's that you mentioned, where we start to say, what do people need to be successful? What's getting in their way, and how can I help? That's what leaders do.
How amazing. In fact, Eryc, I would love to share this insight with you. In our culture back in India, we don't say hello. We don't say hi, right? We say namaste. And the very meaning of namaste is nama plus te, which is I bow to the divinity within you. And truly, in the essence, what it means is to see divinity in everyone else and in ourselves as well. So which means everyone is a part of the same whole. And therefore, if we are all the part of the same whole, then why differentiate, right? Why have the layers of roles and responsibilities and leaders and followers and what you will, everyone's the same. And therefore, with that, be non-judgmental in listening to someone, ask the right questions. And then when you listen, when you hear, you will automatically evoke a response which will be human, and it cannot be more simpler than that, right? It's as simple as that.
That's
in fact,
right.
Does listening also trigger engagement? Eryc, I've seen that, when we talk about involving people in problem solving process or decision making process, the notion is that you will have to ask them to do something and they'll do something, instead of listening to them in terms of what would it take for them to do something worthwhile, what would it take to help them be enabled to do it. So is it again about listening and questioning, or any other approaches you would recommend to build the engagement once we empathize?
Yes, I love that. So just to be explicit, so the 6 E's framework, we've talked about the first one, which is empathize. The second one is called encourage, and I should just pause on that, because I again, words matter, and I am obsessed with the origins of words, etymology. I think it's fascinating. I read etymology looking to understand the past, the present, the future. Like some people divine things from tarot cards. I look at the etymology, and the word encourage really comes from the root of it is cœur, which is heart in French, right? It's about helping to bring the heart in, and so empathizing, listening is really important. But then encourage is about explicitly inviting your fellow humans in to be involved in doing meaningful work, solving meaningful problems. So while the listening is critical, the explicit invitation is also critical. And it's not enough to say, as so many leaders do, my door's always open.
Sure.
Bring me your suggestions. That's not encourage, right? That's passive. So encourage is an active invitation to become involved. So we have to invite our fellow humans to become involved in doing meaningful work. And if we don't do that, there's all sorts of cultural reasons why we won't. So we move from empathy to now I'm explicitly inviting you to give your suggestions for improvement, to identify what we can do better, and to actually get involved. So that so many organizations, as you know, we decide that a certain group of people in the organization is responsible for solving the problems, and then they have to come out and get their fellow humans to do something. They say, we've got this brilliant idea, you now go execute it, which is where the discipline of change management comes from. That's where change management comes from, is now how do we get people to do stuff? And that's not enough. What's more effective, and most change management professionals, to be clear, I'm not disrespecting, most of them know this, that involvement is the key. If we don't involve, then we end up having to coax, cajole, coerce, convince people to do things.
Of course. In fact, to all the listeners and the viewers, as I mentioned in the introduction, Eryc has authored a wonderful book on the 6 E's that he's referring to. And in the description to this video, you will find the link to the book as well. So please go ahead and read it. And on that note then, Eryc, is it right for me, or am I understanding it right when I say that empathizing and encouraging is, one part done, but the other additional part then is to enable the individuals to be able to drive the action that is expected, and that enablement education is the critical factor here as well. So how does one do it the right way? Any recommendations on how that education could be handled in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get to the third E, educate, again, that's a word that I'm still wrestling with, to be honest, because I think that there is a connotation in that word of doing something to people, right? We are going to educate people.
Yes.
But this is where you mentioned I have a master's in education. This is where my educator comes in, which says people are not empty buckets to be filled, right?
Nice.
People are whole humans who come to work with their backgrounds and their experiences and their expertise, and we hired them for a reason. So educate is not about necessarily pouring something into people. We all construct our understanding of the world. And so I come from this constructivist place. So educate for me is about how do we intentionally cultivate conversations in an organization through which we collectively develop a shared understanding of what's important, why it's important, and how each person supports that thing that's important. So when we do that, when we have these intentional conversations with the goal of establishing a shared understanding, we're not telling people to memorize a mission statement, which is fine, but that's rote memorization. We know that that's not education. What we're saying is for you, how do you talk about what's important, why it's important, and what your role is in supporting that? That is what educate is all about. And that's not something that we typically do, right? Typically, we use a very top-down approach to these things. We say, what is the things that people need to know? And there are things that people need to know. That is true. Actually, that comes next in enable. But educate is really that if we don't have a shared understanding of what's important, why it's important, what we have to do with it. And speaking to, I know a lot of your viewers are customer experience professionals, right? There's a lot of, what do we need to teach people about customer experience? That's fine. You can do that. But also let's back up a step and talk about what's going on in the organization. What is the way in which customer experience is going to help us? Why is that important right now? And then we have to, as every CX professional knows, we have to be able to connect an individual to the customer. We have to connect an individual to how what they're doing supports. And we don't do that for them. They come to that conclusion. We are there as leaders to facilitate that learning.
Cannot agree more. In fact, right now as we speak, Eryc, there's a value transformation exercise that I'm driving for an organization, a client of mine. And I remember having this early conversation with the leader who is spirited and passionate about ensuring that the values are communicated, they are enforced, they are enacted. And the initial recommendation from the leader for which I was called for was to have a workshop where there's a top-down communication and enablement on what these values are, what the behaviors aligned to the values are, and so on. And when I thought about it, I felt that this would be probably a unidirectional communication at best. Some people will remember a lot of what's discussed. Some people will enact, and most will forget, and nothing will happen later on. So what I recommended instead was, why not have a bottom-up approach where you begin with conversations with the employees, ask them what values mean to you, how are they, even impacting your current work life, your individual KPIs, your job, how do you enable each other, and so on. So have a big conversation, and then take the listening posts, have the leaders then engage with the next rungs to figure out what can be changed, what can be worked out, and let the final conversation be purely about, this is what we heard, this is what we liked, and this is what we therefore plan to do, and make it a co-creation exercise instead. And I was surprised that it was taken up instantly, which is great. Kudos to the leader to have accepted it.
Well, that's great.
But with your recommendation, I could now resonate that, why is it that it's working better than what it would have otherwise? Because clearly the top-down unidirectional wouldn't have worked. Why would the education be a blocker, Eryc, in your experience, in the sense, wouldn't the employees want to be told what is necessary for them to know to make the job better? Where does the resistance come in from? Is it a resistance, or is it we not understanding as leaders how it operates, how people operate, and what works?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if I know, but here's what I do know. And listening to you talk about what you've done, which I think is brilliant, it occurs to me, if we go back to my story about going to that time management class, and we started with, essentially, what are my values? right?
Right.
Every person is coming with their own values. So the typical exercise is the organization saying, adopt our values,
Right.
adopt our values. And there's a couple of things here that I think are really important. So number one, if we do that, then again, we're dehumanizing, right? We're saying
Correct.
you are nothing without us. Let us give you these values.
Correct.
But
Correct.
but what's also important is that a part of engagement to feel aligned with those organizational values. That is important. That is a part of becoming engaged at work.
Right.
But if I don't have the opportunity to evaluate and say, okay, I'm starting to understand what's important in this organization. I also know what's important to me. Do these things
Right.
align? Because if they don't, let's not play together. Let's go our separate ways. It's better for everyone, right? So I think this is key too, is that, this idea of everyone must embrace. That's not kind or dignified or human. Instead, let's get clear. Let's get clarity and decide who feels connected to these values and who does not. And both of these are equally human-centric outcomes. And that is so much more of a meaningful process, and you end up with so much more connection and commitment. And those are the outcomes we're looking for: connection and commitment. You end up with so much more connection and commitment when you give folks the opportunity to evaluate these things that are important to the organization and the things that are important to me, and can we help each other? That's what we're doing through Eryc.
How amazing. In fact, I would love to bring in one insight from the stories that we have in our literature back in India. So there's this many stories where the priests or the sages in the old days, when they used to approach the king just to ask how the kingdom is being run, they never used to tell them what they need to do to run the kingdom well. They would ask questions. And as part of the questions, they would tell things that the king should be doing. For example, they would say, are you tracking how much taxes is being cut from the people? Are you ensuring that the people are not paying more than what they are earning, and so on? So the questions would be such that the king would be made to think what should be the right way to do things, and then the king would be educated by way of questioning. And when I link it with what you just mentioned, I somehow feel that the questioning and the listening together, when done, it involves people. It helps co-create with them rather than tell them what they're doing. It also builds relevance in them, that it means something to me, it matters to me, and I'm putting in the investment to make this happen as well. So I'm invested. And then when some things are told, it makes it a joint exercise. It makes it a family, a group exercise rather than a unidirectional exercise. So I love it. I love the way you structured it as well. Good takeaways for me, Eryc, on that front.
And for me too. Thank you for sharing that, because it was something I haven't thought about, and that's throughout history and throughout cultures. The most powerful people who didn't necessarily have the political power, but who had the power behind the political power, which you're talking about the gurus, you talk about the Greek philosophers, they had more questions than answers.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
They weren't there to provide answers. Socrates is a great one. Exactly. Yeah. So they had the questions. And the power of asking good questions is to facilitate that learning that happens for each of us internally.
Amazing. We say often that unless the pot is empty, there won't be anything new coming in. This is a metaphor to convey that if you believe you know everything, you will never know anything new. So the questioning is an art to make the pot empty, make the other person realize that, hey, there are gaps. So the question is preparing the ground for the seed to be put in and then nurtured.
But I'm so excited about this, because I think what's also underneath this is this question asking, which is also part of empathize, right? We're asked questions to find out what people need, what's getting in their way. So questions are so key here, and those can't be just a technique. Asking questions can't just be a technique that you learn from reading my book or many other books.
Of course.
The questions must come from genuine curiosity. They have to come from genuine curiosity, and that's where you talk about there's got to be open. I don't know what you call them at the port. There's got to be a place to park the boat at the port, the ship at the port, and that's curiosity, right? That openness. And if we don't have that, if we're just using questions as a cool technique, then we're back to manipulating people.
In fact, I'll give you a quick example of when I used to coach sales leaders on selling with empathy, or humanized way of selling and so on. I used to tell them that ABC is not enough. Always be closing. Focus on ABCDEF, which is developing empathetic friendship, because that's when you will have a better relationship. You'll understand problems, solve problems rather than sell, and so on. And then I saw that a lot of people who I coached, they started using it as a technique. They started using it as a cool way of getting things done. And they tried to be empathetic without being empathetic and so on. It was a technique, as you rightly said. So
Yes.
I added a GHI at the end saying it's ABCDFGHI, which is genuine, honest intentions. Do it with genuine, honest intentions. Without it, it won't work. Can't agree more, Eryc. It has to be genuine. It comes out, the eyes reflect it.
Yes. Yes, it absolutely does. Thank you for sharing that. That's such a powerful framework. I love that.
So now we have talked about empathy, we have talked about encouragement, we have talked about education. What I've often seen is many organizations fail to take the next step where they've told what needs to be done, but they haven't given the tools and the techniques and the processes that the people would need to have in order to deliver. So that is where
Yes.
the enablement comes in now. Are there any better ways of handling the enablement as well, in the way that we talked about all the earlier 3 E's?
Yes. So I think, and again, I want to analogize this for folks who are in customer experience in that world. We all know that managing the voice of the customer, it begins with listening, but it is not listening is not the end either, right? So,
Right.
and I know from doing research that a lot of organizations are really good at surveying customers and really bad at doing anything about what they learn from this, or even deriving learnings from it. And so if empathize and encourage and educate, we're getting all of these, we're doing all of this listening, we're getting all these inputs, we're getting all this information. And now with the next 3 E's, the key is, what do we do with that, to your point? So
Right.
just as with voice of customer management, we take action, we close the loop, right? Enable is part of closing the loop. So in empathize, one of the things that we try to walk away with is, what do people need to be successful? Whether it's knowledge, whether it's skills, whether it's tools or resources, what do they need? And can we equip them with those things? Maybe not all of them, right? So, but the goal is to say, what can we provide that actually gives people the tools to be successful, to do what we need and want them to do. So, I always say that in organizations, we talk a lot about raising the bar on performance.
Right.
You're a
Yes.
good employee, but we're going to raise the bar we want you to be an excellent employee. And I say that the ethical thing to do when you raise the bar is to also raise the floor. And when you raise the floor by making
Nice.
sure people are equipped and enabled with the knowledge, tools, skills, resources that they need to reach that bar.
Fantastic. In fact, I would love to bring in another one-liner from you. You have a lot of one-liners, Eryc, I must say, and they're really good. So one of the one-liners I remember is, you mentioned that, we should not be broadcasting, bribing, and berating employees, because that's not the way to engage. And I couldn't agree more with you. I love it when you say that there is a much critical factor, or another E to your 6 E's, empowerment, which when done rightly, it takes care of these factors as well. Any tricks to improve employee satisfaction and productivity without broadcasting, bribing, and berating, but rather focusing on empowerment? Any tricks, any recommendations for the leaders to do it the right way?
Yes, and I have to say, just in all transparency, Ashutosh, that I'm having a reaction to the word trick. So I'm just gonna point that one out.
Of course,
I just have
taken,
to
well
acknowledge that
taken.
one. But I do believe there are ways to empower people more
Sure.
genuinely, and I love what you bring up about bribery, because I think when we use that, I chose to use that word bribe for a reason, right? Because people say, oh, it's not a
Sure.
bribe, it's an incentive. Okay.
Correct.
And here's the thing. We do all have our incentives. We do all have our motivations, the things that move us. Motivated is to be moved, right? And
Correct.
there are the things that move us. And if we assume that what that thing is monetary, then we are cultivating that mindset. We are cultivating the mindset that you're here to do a thing. And in order to do that, we need to not pleasant otherwise, right? So there's not any kind of intrinsic motivators to it, right? And I remember early in my career, a leader coming to me and saying, "Just tell me what motivates people." And I said, that's the wrong question. The question is what motivates Ashutosh, right? The question is what motivates Eryc. The question is not what motivates people. Nice. That's not a thing, right? So that right away takes us back to empathize, which is also, let's understand what are people's needs, aspirations, fears, motivations, understanding that whole part of who we are. We all have aspirations and needs and fears and motivations. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand how to empower them. And so empower, the E for empower is actually really about making it easy for our fellow humans to do what they're there to do, and to become the best versions of themselves through that work. And so what I find time and time again in organizations is will say, delight the customer, for example, right? Let's take that one. Delight your customer. But then there's a policy that says that you are only authorized to give $10 credit to the customer. $10 isn't going to delight much of anybody in today's world. So what can we do to actually make it easy for folks to do what we say is important? Right? We've agreed on what's important, why it's important, what your role is, but now what's getting in the way? And so this again comes from empathize. What's getting in your way? So in Empower, we're saying, first of all, there are often policies and processes in organizations that are there for a reason, but have negative unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
That are actually causing friction for our fellow humans in the workplace, right? That are making it more difficult, not easier for them to do what we've asked them to do. And so examining those policies and processes, revising them where we can, adding some if we can as well. So I always like to bring into when I talk about Empower, I always like to talk about everyone knows the Ritz-Carlton. Everyone, especially in that's watching this podcast, knows the Ritz-Carlton, knows this thing that they have that is every employee gets $2,000 per guest per day to delight a customer, right? Solve a problem, satisfy. But what a lot of people don't know is that is a policy put in place to empower employees. They encourage employees to sign on to a list of something like 12 promises. And one of those promises that employees make is, I completely own and resolve customer issues. I completely own and resolve customer issues. Right? That's an expectation that is set. And lots of organizations have that, whether implicitly or explicitly, completely own and resolve customer issues. But then there isn't a policy in place to actually make that possible.
Nice.
And often there are policies in place that make that impossible. So what Ritz-Carlton has done is said, we've asked you to make this promise to completely own, and the way that we are backing you with that is by saying we have these $2,000. Right. So that is an example of Empower really in action. They do a great job of that.
How amazing. In fact, all of us have been customers in one instance or the other. And whenever we interact with the staff, on the ground, organizations often call them frontline, which is as if the expectation is they're going to a war when they're not. They're just interacting with customers.
Yes.
But often this simple aspect of empowerment is missed. And we experience that day in, day out. In many cases, we see that the person wants to help us, but they just don't have the authority to do so. And they're just waiting for someone to approve, grant. Eryc, I can't agree more. But now that we have covered all the 5 E's, the major one is recognition. We are hungry for association. We are hungry for acceptance. We are hungry for validation. All of us as humans, we want that. We crave for that validation, if you will. If despite all the genuine intent and efforts, if that doesn't come, it disheartens, it demotivates the individual. I feel if someone did something great, just reach out and say wonderful, right? That 1 minute could do so much for the individual. And that simple act and moment is often missed in an organization. So what would you recommend to organizations to take care of this very piece, which is equally important?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. So this 6th E, which is called embrace, I have tried to pull it away from our typical approaches, which is all of my dear friends who work in HR departments around the world have rewards and recognition programs.
Right.
And so recognition has become synonymous with reward. Reward has become synonymous with money. And so we've tied all this up. So I want to pull us away from that with this word embrace. And embrace is about noticing and celebrating. We notice and we celebrate. And that's not just achievements. It's not just outcomes. It's not, a great quarter. It's the attitudes, the mindsets, the behaviors, and the outcomes that we want and need to cultivate. And so through embrace, what we need to do is go back to our empathy, go back to our understanding of who each person is, of their needs, aspirations, fears, and motivations, and say, how can I notice and celebrate this person for their attitudes, their mindsets, their behaviors? And the way we do that is, I think there's 5 attributes that I think are often missing from rewards and recognition programs. Rewards and recognition programs are usually achievement based, or they go to the hardest worker, the person who works the longest hours. But I say that these 5 attributes are really what's key to embracing effectively. So they are, first of all, it's personalized. It is, again, tailored to what is important to you. So for some people, maybe it's just a quiet word between the two of us. For some people, it's public. For some people, it's money. For some people, it's other things. So personalized is important. The next one, and you alluded to this, is that it's frequent. Effective embracing is frequent. Happens a lot. There's a ton of research out there, and I'll talk about John Gottman. Talks about in relationships where for every negative interaction that we have, we need at least 5 positive interactions to offset that. Because negative is so powerful. It's so powerful. Roy Baumeister has a book called the Power of Bad, in which he talks about all of the research that shows just how much negative things affect us. So negative things that happen to us in the workplace all the time. It is part of work because it's part of life. But if it's then we're saying we're trying to offset. So 5 to 1 is the ratio, that sort of the golden ratio.
Wow.
The next attribute, so personalized, frequent, relevant is the next attribute, and this is really key. Tying the thing that we're noticing and celebrating, tying it to what's important and why it's important. So embrace is reinforcing what we got to, and educate as well, right? To say we're going to connect this. If we're only noticing and celebrating that somebody has been here for 30 years, which we should celebrate. But it doesn't tie us to what's important, why it's important. What it tells us is what's important is sticking around, persistence and tenacity, endurance. So relevant. So personalized, frequent, relevant. The next one is that it is significant. That is to say, it's meaningful to me. It moves me. And the last one is timely. And you alluded to this as well, that it happens as close as possible to the thing that we're acknowledging, right? That we're noticing and celebrating. We don't wait a quarter or a year. That's not effective as an embrace approach. So the thing that we're doing here with this personalized, frequent, relevant, significant, and timely is that when we, and sorry, the S also stands for specific. So what exactly am I noticing in someone? And this is really key as well, right? So we're saying very specifically, I saw that you did this. That's important because thank you for doing that. Right. That's the framework I suggest for that quick conversation that you mentioned.
Sure.
I noticed this. Here's why that matters. Thank you. And I think that organizations, there's 2 things. One, they think that just saying thank you is enough. But more importantly, I think organizations and leaders are often afraid of thanking people too much. And I don't think we can thank people too much. I think we all want to feel valued and appreciated, and embrace is about helping people feel valued and appreciated, and reinforcing what's important and why it's important. So that's the way to do embrace effectively, to notice and celebrate.
I cannot agree more. It's such a powerful 5-word framework. Wonderful that you shared the 6 E's with us, Eryc. For the leaders who want to build the human-centric organization, who want to follow the 6 E's, any advice to these young leaders? I will, of course, be sharing the link to your book, but any other where they could reach out to you, learn from you, engage with you, please advise how and where.
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. So first of all, I will say that I have a link for your viewers. So this link here, eryceyl.com/XT podcast, that join my email list and get a free download of the first chapter of the book. That way you can check out the book and see if it's something that you want to dig into further on me. So that's a step to take. But I would also say, whenever I talk to leaders, and what I find is that most leaders do want to take care of their fellow humans. They really do.
Yes.
And what I'm trying to do is provide the disciplines they can practice, not steps to take, but disciplines to practice that can help them do that with integrity in a way that gets results. They get to keep their jobs while they also keep their head and their heart with them. So I think that the biggest advice that I have is listen more, talk less. And of course, I'm not demonstrating that today because we're doing a podcast interview and my job is to talk here today. But listen more, talk less, ask more questions than giving answers. These are the things to start with. Keeping track of your ratio in conversations. In fact, I don't know if you know about this tool. There's a tool for online meetings like the one that you and I are having right now called Fathom. And it's an AI tool that provides you with notes and all that sort of thing. But one of the things it also does is it gives you little reminders of how much you're talking.
Wow.
How much you're talking. And it says, in this conversation between Ashutosh and Eryc is talking 90% of the time. And it gives me that feedback to say, I'm not being a good conversationalist here. I'm not listening. Right?
Wow.
So again, different in a podcast interview, but thinking about that in your day-to-day life, what's the percentage that I'm talking versus listening, and just start to adjust that ratio so that there's more listening than talking. That's my one thing we can all start today, and I'm always working on myself.
Amazing. Eryc, if I see a leader who doesn't use jargon, who doesn't use complicated language to communicate what he or she is trying to convey to me. And if someone can simply and succinctly share knowledge, as deep a knowledge in most simple words possible, I know that the person has not only learned but implemented things that and practiced things that is walk the talk, and clearly you're the
Yes.
one who has done it, Eryc. In this conversation, I'm the one who learned a lot. I spoke less, but I definitely learned a lot. You corrected me on a few things. I stand corrected on, and I realized that words do matter. So trick is surely not
Yes.
the right word to use. I'll keep that in mind going forward. And many other words that I used incorrectly. So I stand corrected. One session, lot of learnings. Thank you so much for joining, Eryc. Really appreciate you joining us and for sharing your knowledge and insights. Wonderful engaging with you and looking forward to engage further as well.
Yes, can't wait to talk more. Thanks, Ashutosh. Have a great day.